want to bring in former Utah Congressman and Fox News contributor Jason Chaffetz right now. Jason, it's good to see you.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Your reaction to what took place first overnight, the fact that the fiscal restraint Republicans are gone, and now this market is trading so nervously on this idea of trillion-dollar deficit.
Well, look, the Republicans are drunk on spending. I mean, it's an absolute embarrassment. Dagan's exactly right. In off years, or when the Republicans are in minority, they are all about fiscal discipline and everything. And what Rand Paul was saying last night was absolutely right. You were principally opposed to Obama deficits, but when suddenly Republicans in charge, we're at record levels here.
Yeah.
Remember, we were paying about $600 million a day in interest. That was the daily interest rate. We're now approaching $1 billion a day in a daily interest pay. I mean, you can't continue on in perpetuity here. We don't have a revenue problem, but we have a massive spending problem. And there was nothing that was done to actually curb back spending.
I want to ask you what the solutions are, how to curb back. But you mentioned Rand Paul, and the Kentucky senator was really the reason that the vote was held up last night in the Senate. Here's what he said.
They're all holding hands, and there's only one bad guy standing in the way. One guy's going to keep us here till 3 in the morning. Well, you know what? I think the country's worth a debate till 3 in the morning, frankly. So the reason I'm here tonight is to put people on the spot. I want people to feel uncomfortable. I want them to have to answer people at home who said, how come you were against President Obama's deficits, and then how come you're for Republican deficits? Isn't that the very definition of intellectual dishonesty?
And as he spoke throughout the night and kept speaking, the midnight deadline came and went. The government shut down, and they did a vote this morning at around 5 a.m., Jason. What's the answer? What should they have pulled back on, discretionary spending or military?
Well, look, Paul Ryan has promised two things. Budget reform, because since the 1974 Budget Reform Act came into place, it's only worked 4 times. So that's broken. But he's been promising that for a long time, and it's never happened. The other thing is he said, now we're going to do entitlement reform. The problem with that is you lost the tool, which is called reconciliation. And it's highly technical, but that threshold where you only have to get to 50 plus 1 votes in the Senate, that tool, and I have to confirm this, but has been lost by doing this package. And so it's fantasy land to think you're going to do entitlement reform and get to 60 votes in the Senate.
So they shouldn't have done the package then?
I hate this package. Right. I mean, if you care, if you're a fiscal hawk, I mean, I hate it. We needed more defense spending, but did we need $180 some odd billion more? I don't know.
But you talk about the tool. Even when they had the tool for Obamacare, it wasn't about the tool. It was about the will. And Obamacare was the easiest piece of entitlement reform to take care of. There's no way.
Exactly
if you can't do that, you can't do Social Security, you can't do Medicare. So it seems to me every single promise or commitment to do something about entitlements is a bald-faced lie. Am I wrong about that?
No, look, President Trump has said as much. He said in the campaign, I'm not going to touch Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. We're not going to go there.
He would have signed that Medicaid reform, though, that the Senate Republicans failed to pass last year, because that's essentially what it was. It was trying to place greater responsibility on the states for the uptick in Medicaid spending under Obamacare. But you had the likes of Shelley Moore Capito. Was she the one who said, I didn't come to Washington to hurt people? Again, it's they're using the Dems playbook.
If you take just the discretionary part of the budget, which is roughly a quarter of it, then you look at it, it's about a 13% increase. There is not, and I heard Jim Jordan talk about this, there is not a single Republican on the planet that ran for office and said, I'm going to increase your spending by 13%. I mean, you couldn't have ever gotten the nomination.
Yeah.
That's right. And if you ask them now, they would probably say we need more Republicans in the Senate so we don't have to do these kind of deals.
The president said that,
as we've pointed out, Republicans, except for Rand Paul, kind of gleefully going along here. So how does this end? They weren't willing to reform Medicaid, Obamacare. We're seeing now they're not willing to reduce or even do any kind of restraint on discretionary spending. Do we hit a wall someday?
Yeah,
or is there a hopeful scenario where you could see the coalition that could finally bring some discipline.
It really won't come into play until the 2020 election. But remember, we come back on March 23rd because while that's the budget framework, they actually have to go back and do the appropriations. So you've only go through all these gyrations. We only funded the government through March 23rd. So we get to do this again.
But the 2020 election, I mean, by all indications, President Trump is going to sign this monstrosity. So is he going to become a spending hawk between now and then?
No. I mean, the Republicans have lost every single bit of credibility on the idea that they care at all about debts and deficits. You can talk all you want, but when they had a chance to do it, they caved and they spent so much money. It's stunning.
What are the implications? Talk about the implications of all of this debt. That's what markets are reacting to. Okay, so maybe they're prioritizing growth and they don't want to deal with deficits right now and they don't care. Implications.
The fundamental problem here is we're going to be paying more than $1 billion a day in an interest payment because you are having rising it. I mean, we've been paying next to nothing on that. There are other priorities that you have to be able to put into place. But government continues to grow. Guess what? When the government gets hundreds of billions of dollars more, what do they get? They get more regulators. So the president has done a good job of bringing down regulation. But when you get literally tens of thousands of more regulators out there, you're going to get more regulations.
Higher debt costs for the government, ultimately it siphons resources away from private business and the overall U.S. economy. To put that in perspective, I said this earlier, the TSA's annual budget is about $7.5 billion. So literally we could fund the TSA in 1 week's interest payments on the national debt, right? It's $1 billion a day.
I just think some real smart economists are going to have to dive in there and figure out what the economic input. But remember,
something's got to give, right? I mean,
on the discretionary side of the budget, defense is the largest, over $700 billion. But when you're going to spend more than $1 billion a day in interest, then.
But in this discretionary spending, $131 billion domestic increase, community health centers, child care grants, despite the changes in the tax code for the child tax credit, $20 billion in infrastructure, $6 billion for opioid addiction.
And then there's the recovery. Don't forget the emergency recovery money, $80 billion. I mean, those are things that they weren't expecting.
Yeah, you can understand the spending on the disaster relief. But again, and you've got military spending now that money, if we spent domestically, I think will help the economy. But when Barack Obama did his $787 billion stimulus program, he grew government. That's what happens. Is when the government has too much money, they grow government.
What do you want to say?
Well, we've been blaming these politicians that we, the American people, elected. But as investors, it looks like on the futures markets, they're not completely trashing this deal. So some people seem to think this is good. Government spends more money. That's a short-term GDP boost. I think long-term, it's not a good thing. So maybe it's an education effort.
What about that?
That's too expensive an education. Can I just say that? That's too expensive an education.
It wasn't too long ago that I believe I think it was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs who came and testified before Congress. The single biggest threat to the United States is the deficit and the debt that we're spending. I mean, we're north of $20 trillion. When I was elected to Congress in 2008, it was about $8 trillion.
How did the Soviet Union collapse?
You can't just spend your way out of this. And again,
well, the debt was doubled though under President Obama.
Yeah, but
I mean, from 10 to 20 trillion.
But like I said on Twitter, almost every Republican has now lost the right to complain about that.
But that deficit was when Republicans took over the House, brought it down in the $400 billion range. Now it's back up over $1 trillion.
Forever.